In this lecture, we'll look at Helene Cixous and Jacques Derrida's co-authored book, Veils. Now, one of the reasons why I find this an interesting text is because both Cixous and Derrida were Jewish people living in Algeria, where they were born, and they then later both became very prominent critical theorists in France. They were a part of a generation of Jewish people, French Jewish people who lived in Algeria. And then later, in the case of Derrida, for instance, his family lost his French citizenship during the Vichy period. And then he and Cixous both went to France, and they studied in Paris, and they became very prominent figures, intellectuals. And I think, as Jewish intellectuals, but also figures who are steeped in critical theory, philosophy, they have a lot to teach us about the question of the veil from both a theoretical perspective and from a Jewish perspective. So let's take a look at what they have to say. It's not a very long book. It's an instance of what Cixous, similar to what Cixous did in her book, or in her short essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, which is an interesting hybrid of critical theory plus and poetic writing, narrative, reflection, memoir. So too is Veils. On the one hand, in both cases, it's quite theoretical, but it's also very personal, intimate. And I think if you're looking at these texts also from the perspective of being a creative writer, in addition to having a more general interest in the question of the veil, it really does show us possibilities of what creative writing can be in breaking down some of these boundaries between these established categories of, let's say, philosophy and critical theory and creative writing, the poetic, which often are thought of as separate. They, following Nietzsche, blur some of these lines. So it's an interesting text. They had a close relationship. Cixous also wrote a book on Derrida as well, an interesting book, and they're certainly worth a look. So let's start now. In the case of Cixous, she was born in French Algeria in 1937. She's still alive. She's best known for Laugh of the Medusa, which is an essay that's commonly anthologized in critical theory books. If you're an English major, a student of literature, Laugh of the Medusa is one of those texts that is canonical and that everybody must read as to gain an understanding into feminism and into deconstruction, French critical theory as well. So I highly recommend this. I think you'll find it an enjoyable work as well. She also wrote a book with an author named Clément called The Newly Born Woman, 1986. These are just two books. If you go check out her Wikipedia site, you'll see that she's a very prolific writer. And she has produced many texts during her lifetime, and I find it interesting as someone who has particularly been interested in Derrida for a number of years to see the confluence between their thinking and how similar their thinking really is. And so this text really brings that into question. Or into focus, but also question, because we're going to see again that Derrida is going to challenge some of the things that Cixous says in her brief piece. Now, Derrida was born in Algeria as well. He lived from 1930 to 2004. The texts that I mentioned here of Grammatology, Circumfession, Spectres of Marx, Philosophy in a Time of Terror, these are just a few of the texts that he produced. He was extraordinarily prolific. Many of his lectures today are still being translated into English and published. There'll be many more in the years to come. I find these interesting. I mentioned Spectres of Marx because I also have some lectures on the same website on Spectres of Marx if you want to explore that. Circumfession is interesting from the perspective of Derrida being a North African thinker, North African man who lived in Algeria till he was about 19. And this is a term that, he addresses the question of, let's say, the Algerian heritage of Augustine as well, a very important Christian theologian. And so circumcision is partly a reference to Augustine's Confessions as a fellow North African writer, philosopher, but also Derrida, unlike Augustine, was not a Christian, he was Jewish, and so circumcision brings together the word circumcision and confession together in this interesting new way of thinking about it. Here, this is one of Derrida's most autobiographical texts. I recommend it, particularly if you're interested in the question of Derrida's, African heritage, his identity as what he calls himself in Circumfession, a Black Arab Jew, or as a man who has a particular ethnic, cultural, religious identity that has affected him very deeply, and is, I think, something really important to consider when you read his thinking. And when you read his, a lot of times Derrida is approached as a strictly European philosopher. He was a European philosopher, and in some ways his thought is somewhat Eurocentric in my view. But he also has a perspective that was really impacted very much by this different background he had, both as an African man and as a Jewish man as well. And not merely a Ashkenazi or European Jew, but a Sephardic Jew, a Maghrebian Jew, which is particularly distinct ethnic identity that I think shaped his philosophy in ways that are often ignored, but important to bear in mind. Now, in the case of Cixous, her little narrative, I say little because it's not very long. It's entitled Savoir. It comes at the beginning of this text. And so she writes this wonderful little narrative about the experience of undergoing corrective eye surgery and how it really changes her and shapes her. And this is what Derrida is going to be responding to. And so even though Derrida's response is somewhat longer, Cixous is important because Derrida's response wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Cixous writing this narrative essay called Savoir that he's responding to. Now, savoir is a French word. It means to know. Derrida plays around with the S apostrophe avoir, which is to have as well, and a matter of having, of knowledge as well. And so Derrida is very playful in his etymologies. That's important to know too, is often takes a very literal reading of philosophy in ways that some have found frustrating. And I note in passing that if you're coming to Derrida's work for the first time, even more so than Cixous, he's noted for being a very difficult thinker. And he is difficult. His thinking does provide challenges, as does Cixous in some cases as well. But I think this text, what I want to try to do here in this lecture is to make this essay, both of these little essays, comprehensible, particularly for those coming to the thinking of Derrida for the first time. Now, this is also in the context, I have another lecture on this YouTube channel on Fatema Mernissi's The Veil and the Male Leader, Fatema Mernissi on the veil or the hijab. And so it might be interesting for you to compare what Cixous and Derrida as North African Maghrebian Jews say about the veil, and what Mernissi as a Maghrebian Muslim woman says about the veil or the hijab. And we're going to see too in this particular lecture or in this lecture about this text, that Derrida is going to respond to the Christian Pauline view on the veil as well. And so this, by looking at these three texts, the text of Mernissi, the veil and the male elite, and Cixous and Derrida veils, it gives us pretty good insight into differences in the various Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam on the question of the veil itself. So what Derrida is going to respond to most strongly is the fact that Cixous is going to describe her myopia or her nearsightedness and its removal during elective laser eye surgery as akin to the removal of a veil and her ability to know things in ways that she didn't know after she can see much more clearly following her elective laser or corrective eye surgery. And nowadays, this is a very common procedure. And so it's perhaps a procedure that many readers today can identify with if you've gone through corrective eye surgery, to know how very strange it can be to suddenly see the world in a very, very different way. And so this was a Cixous situation as well. She had myopia or nearsightedness, and after having this surgery, it completely reoriented her bodily experience, in effect. And this is what she's commenting upon. So she's theorizing what happened to her, but she's theorizing something deeply personal, something that actually affected her physically. So she says myopia was her fault, her lead, her imperceptible native veil. And so she compares her myopia or her nearsightedness to having a veil. And so after she has this surgery, she's going to have this veil removed, torn away, in effect. And she says she had been born with the veil in her eye. She's talking about herself. A severe myopia stretched its maddening magic between her and the world. She had been born with the veil in her soul. So really, really interesting way of describing this experience of myopia. And if you look at the glasses there, you can see what it's like for people that wear corrective lenses. They can perhaps see close up for reading even, but objects in the distance look very blurry. And so when you put the glasses on, you can see them. And so suddenly now she can see things far away. And you can imagine how if you'd spent your whole life seeing trees blurry, and suddenly now, even without glasses, you can see them so clearly, how you'd have to really reorient your body in the world. So myopia is, again, it's a condition in which close objects appear clearly, but far ones don't. So this was Cixous' condition, which was changed after she had this surgery. And she says, reflecting on this experience, she says she hadn't realized the day before that eyes or miraculous hands, had never enjoyed the delicate tact of the cornea, the eyelashes, the most powerful hands, these hands that touch impreponderably near and far off hears. She had not realized that eyes are lips on the lips of God. She had just touched the world with her eye, and she thought, it is I who see. I would be thus my eyes. I, the encounter, the meeting point between my soul and you. Now, there are many, there's a really interesting and complex context behind this. It's the philosopher Hegel who called eyes the windows to the soul. It's the meeting point between the soul and the outside world. And in Greek philosophy, Plato's going to say, the eyes are the greatest gift that the gods, give us, because because through vision we learn about time, through watching, say, the starry constellations in the heavens. So eyes are very important. I would note too, another context here is that Aristotle is going to call, he's going to say touch is the master sense, and that we can lose all other senses except touch, because if we lose our sense of touch, we're dead. But so in this sense, we can think of what she's suggesting here, or that eyes are akin in the way that Aristotle suggests to touching. Your eyes literally touch the things that they see. And so she has a very acute realization of this, that her eyes are like hands that can touch after she has this surgery, and can reach out and see objects in a way that she couldn't possibly imagine before. But also, now this is a very sort of Cartesian notion, this idea that it's that the eye that you see with, Descartes speaks of the pineal gland, which is he believed that there was some organ inside the head that was this linkage point between what appears in the internal and the external world. And we find this in Plato's Timaeus as well, as that the eye is the place where the internal and the external meet, when the light from the outside collides with what Plato believed to be this light that burns in the burning sphere of the logos at the center of the armillary sphere in the head, that comes together and collides on the eye. And so she's having not just a physiological experience, but an experience that is reorienting her way of thinking about the world in a philosophical sense. She says, myopia was her truth. This myopia that had chosen her and placed her apart was as undetachable from her as her blood from her vein. It was she. She was it, its inaudible, incessant murmur. And this is, of course, quite poetic. Today, her sister, anger, was dying. I. Suddenly, myopia, the other, the unwelcome, is unveiled. The other was none other than her sweetheart, her modest companion born. Her dear secret, already the mysterious tundra of always was effaced. Farewell, my sweetheart, my mother. She's saying farewell to her myopia. Now it was time to bid cruel and tender farewell to the veil she had cursed so much. Now at last I can love my myopia, that gift in reverse. I can love it because it is going to come to an end. Now, this is quite poetic. She's using a series of metaphors to describe her myopia. She calls it her mother, her sweetheart, but most importantly for Derrida, she calls it her veil. And the veil is in effect taken from her now that she's had this surgery. She loves it in nostalgia because it's gone from her. And this is what Derrida is responding to. But she's going to say, she's going to think more about this. And I think interesting from this perspective of her being a Jewish woman, she's going to compare it and also to not just to the veil, but to Jerusalem as well. She says, do not forget me. Keep forever the world suspended, desirable, refused, that enchanted thing I had given you, murmured myopia. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right eye, etc. I see coming in place of my diffuse reign, a reign without hesitation. I shall always hesitate. I shall not leave my people. I belong to the people of those who do not see. Now here, she's saying something that we're going to find Derrida to be in agreement with. And okay, so let me explain. So she says, now that she can see clearly, and I've inserted this word here in place of my diffuse reign, a Cartesian reign without hesitation. She's contrasting this idea of Cartesian certitude or certainty or vision, that being able to see the truth, and truth, what Descartes will, for instance, call, competence, as in, being a matter of correct perception, right seeing. And she's going to be a little, skeptical about this. She say, look, I'm not one of those who affirm, and I'm interpreting and paraphrasing it here, but I'm not one of those who affirm a kind of a Cartesian idea of correct perception. I belong to a people who are people who hesitate, people who question. And this is more, if you can think of the idea of Israel being a wrestler and Judaism, Judaic theology, interpretation of Torah being a matter of wrestling with the text rather than asserting a correct interpretation of the text. So to be a Jew in this sense is to be someone who wrestles with the meaning of the text as opposed to, say, asserting a Cartesian notion of what a true or correct interpretation of a text might be. And so when she says, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, she's saying, I don't want to get stuck in a kind of Cartesian certainty. I want to keep this uncertainty, this unknowing that was the experience of having this veil. And so she's wanting to, retain the, this living in this experience of unknowing that is the experience of having the veil. And this is something that Derrida, as I said, will pick up on, but it's also, again, a key theme. And let's put it in theological terms as well. We could say that in the Christian tradition, Jesus is said to be God. God is something that one can see with one's eyes. But in the Judaic tradition, as well as in the Islamic tradition, Jesus is not God. And so, therefore, God is the God that continues to hide his face from us, let's say, from the Judaic perspective, the Islamic perspective, say, as articulated by a theologian like Al-Ghazali, would reject any association of anthropomorphic imagery with the divine. But the point is that we don't know. We can't see that God, that whoever or whatever God is veiled from us. And this is what she's holding on to as a part of her Jewish identity. Okay, now in 1990, Derrida published a book called Memoirs of the Blind, and this was linked to a project that he participated with at the Louvre in Paris, where the Louvre in Paris it only displays a fraction of the many, many paintings that it has, and of course it stores many others. And so he was asked to select a number of paintings for display and then to comment on some of them. And this book contains the paintings that he selected with the commentaries that he wrote after this exhibit. And it's a very interesting book. I definitely recommend it. But it was interesting that many of the paintings that he selected were paintings of blindness. And so he's reiterating this in this text, reiterating the same notion that Cixous is alluding to here when she compares her myopia to a veil and also to Jerusalem, which she does not want to forget. She wants to hold on to this notion, and so too does Derrida in his Memoirs of the Blind. So if you're interested in pursuing this contrast, I do recommend looking at this text. And the image on the left is one of the images that Derrida selected. And you can see there a man sort of groping in the dark with the blindfold on. And so we can think of this idea of not knowing, of being blind, and also in Judaic theology we could think of this is the Derridian articulation of this is not logocentric, but it is phonocentric in the sense that seeing is secondary to hearing. That we could think of Abraham when he welcomes the visitors into his tent and then gets a blessing, and it turns out that these visitors are angels, but it's not something that he gains by looking at them. It's something that he experiences through hearing. He listens, he hears, and then he only then later does he see. Now, on the right, you can see a statue of a Greek, god, and in the Greek tradition, Heidegger, for instance, is going to say the Greeks were eye people, that that truth was something that one perceived through one's eyes. And so Derrida and Cixous, again, as Algerian, North African, Maghrebian Jewish people, are not going to be as, let's say, reflexively eye people in the way that a lot of Greco-Roman people are, and in the Christian tradition as well, that insists on seeing. We might think, even for instance, in the second commandment, which I mentioned in my previous lecture on Mernissi, that if it's dropped essentially in the Christian religion, because in the Christian religion Jesus is said to be God. God shows himself to us, and so the ban on graven images is dropped, because in the Christian view now we know what God looks like. We have seen God, and so therefore God can represent himself to us as such. Now, in Judaism and Islam both, since Jesus is not God, we still don't know what God looks like. The second commandment is still there, why we still have the ban on graven images in Judaism and Islam. And so this is, again, also one of the reasons for this insistence on being veiled and being blind that we find in both Cixous and in Derrida. Now, in Derrida's response, which he entitled "A Silkworm of One's Own," the first part of it was, I think he was probably in an airplane. He was riding towards Buenos Aires. This was written on November 24th through the 29th in 1995. And so he was traveling South America, and he's reading Cixous' Savoir, and he's reflecting upon it as he writes his own response to it. And these are the opening passages of his text. He says, "Before the verdict, my verdict, before befalling me, it drags me down with it in its fall. Before it's too late, stop writing, full stop, period. Before it's too late, go off to the ends of the earth like a mortally wounded animal. Fasting, retreat, departure, as far as possible. Lock oneself away with oneself in oneself. Try finally to understand oneself alone in oneself. Stop writing here, but instead, from afar, defy a weaving, yes, from afar. or rather see to its diminution. In diminution, if I understand aright, the work is not undone. Now, there's a lot going on in this little passage. I can't unpack it all here, but I'll just say a few things. This idea, what he's really, this criticizing of this notion of locking oneself away within oneself, which he sees also as a kind of a temptation. He can just stop writing, get out of textuality altogether, and just retreat. Again, he's referring here to a kind of a Cartesian ipsity, the mind-body separation, just the idea of the soul disembodied, the disembodied soul totally separate, the soul that in Descartes' discourse on method that's totally separate from the body, which is totally also independent and outside, would be an outside of writing, an outside of discourse, in effect, and outside of the external and empirical world, to be a transcendental experience of self. Now, this is a temptation, but it's one that he doesn't give into. Instead, he affirms this idea of a weaving. And so we could think of textuality of writing as akin to an act of weaving. And he'll compare it to, like, he'll refer to, say, Penelope, who weaves and unweaves the web of the shroud of the father of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey. And so in a way, he's going to say, I'm going to do a little unweaving myself here of Cixous' text, not to tear it apart in a deconstructive sense, not to just unravel it, but to, not to undo it altogether. He's not undoing the work, but he sees it being maybe a little too tightly woven together, and he wants to loosen it up a little bit. And I think, whereas he was probably more affirmative of those last passages we read from Cixous, some of those passages in her poetic text, which refer to her surgery as an unveiling, or her loss of myopia as an unveiling, he's going to be a little uncomfortable with, because for Derrida, really, there's never really any loss of, there's no way to be completely unveiled in this way, and to make that suggestion would to slip into kind of a Greco-Roman Christian theology that he's going to be of unconcealment, to put it in Heideggerian terms, aletheia, that he's going to be a little bit more cautious about. So he'll say indeterminable diminution. For you must know right now, he's speaking very intimately as he's having this conversation with Cixous. To touch that which one calls veil is to touch everything. You'll leave nothing intact, safe and sound, neither in your culture, nor in your memory, nor in your language, as soon as you take on the word veil. As soon as you let yourself be caught up in it, nothing will remain. Nothing will remain anymore, he says. And then later he says, you poor thing, finishing with the veil will always have been the very movement of the veil. Unveiling oneself, reaffirming the veil in unveiling. Finishing with the veil is finishing with the self. There's no chance of that ever happening, of belonging to oneself enough. You'll end up in immanence, and the unveiling still remain a movement of the veil. Will still remain a movement of the veil. Excuse me. And so, a total unveiling would be akin again to this notion of belonging, of this sort of Cartesian ipsity that he is criticizing. Or again, if you're not familiar with this word ipsity, think of it in Descartes, where you have the mind-body split. Descartes' going to say in Discourse on Method that the soul is completely transcendental, completely separate from the body, and when the body dies, the soul continues to live in this transcendental sense. And Derrida's, we could say one thing he could say, he's being a little skeptical of the possibility of this Cartesian mind-body split, and also of the soul itself, of the self, the true I, ever being revealed or unconcealed, unveiled as such. There's no way of, whatever the true self is. And Derrida is not necessarily saying that there's no such thing as a true self, a true ipsity, a true irreducible self behind, let's say, the appearance, what appears like behind the eyes. If we were to look into, in this Hegelian sense, if we were to look into the eyes of the other Do we see the soul? If the eyes are the windows to the soul in the Hegelian sense, do we ever really see the soul? No, when we look in the eyes of the other, we see an image of ourself on the eyelids of, on the lens of the eyes of the other. But Derrida is saying, look, you can't see the soul as such. There's no experience of the soul as such. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's no there, to put it, to quote Mrs. Gertrude Stein or Ms. Gertrude Stein, but it does mean that whatever this self is, it remains veiled. And this is, I think, Derrida's point, is that we don't ever see it. It's hidden from us. The other is, as he's going to say in The Gift of Death, every other is every bit other. It's completely the other is completely other from us. We don't see the other. It's the other. Whoever the other is remains veiled. Now, in the Judaic tradition, there's in the Torah, or what Christians call the Old Testament, there is, of course, the story of Moses. When he sees God on Sinai and brings the Ten Commandments down, he wears a veil over his head because his head is said to be so radiant, having seen God, that it blinds those who look upon him. And so in the biblical text, he covers his face with a veil. But also I might note that Moses does not actually see the face of God. He crouches behind a bush, and the biblical text says God walks past him and he sees his hind parts. But in any case, he's so radiant, he has to wear a veil because the others who look upon him are blinded by the radiant light that shines forth from him. Now, on the right, you see Michelangelo's famous statue of Moses, and here the horns, they're not demonic horns. The horns are Michelangelo's depiction of the halo itself, or of the light that shines forth from the prophet Moses. So there's the veil in this sense. In the Judaic tradition, this is an important reference to a veil in Judaism, but also, again, as Christians like Michelangelo read the biblical text too. The reference, though, that you don't find in Judaism that's very important in the Christian tradition is the story, and this is a visual image of this, of when Jesus is crucified on the cross. And you can see there on the far right, you can see him on the cross in the distance. And in the biblical text, the gospel says that when he dies, at that moment, the veil in the temple is ripped open. And so Derrida is going to think a bit about this. This is a really interesting moment in the text, and one that we need to kind of carefully work with. So let's think about this. This is in Matthew 27, 50 through 52. And here's the gospel text on this. Says, when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he yielded up his spirit. Of course, in the Christian tradition, then he dies for 3 days, and then he's resurrected from the dead. I might note in passing, too, that in the Islamic tradition, this, as well as Judaism, this never happens because Jesus does not even die on the cross in the Islamic tradition. Muslims affirm his prophetic vocation, but the Quran says that a substitute was placed there for him. And of course, in Judaism, he was merely an outlaw. So there would be nothing supernatural attached to his death. But in the Christian tradition, it said that at the moment that he yielded up his spirit, that very moment, the veil in the temple, where Jews worship, was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth quaked and the rocks were split. The tombs broke open and the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So Derrida is going to fix his attention on this story in the gospel about this is yet another version of the veil, and the veil being torn open. Now, so since Cixous is saying that her veil was removed, and this is precisely, again, we see the cautionary note here in Derrida is that when the veil is removed, is the veil ever removed at all? Now, we could think of if Jesus is the God-man in the Christian tradition, he is we could to put it in metaphysical terms, we could say that the being of beings, the being in a transcendental sense, in the realm of beings, in the world of becoming, to put it in Platonic terms, becomes unconcealed. It becomes essentially an event in time where the truth is disclosed as an event in time. And this is what is one prominent interpretation of what occurred during this event, is that the truth of Jesus's incarnate nature is revealed at this moment. The veil is torn from the temple. Here's what Derrida says: of course, you will not forget that the temple veil was torn on the death of the Messiah. The other one, the ancestor from Bethlehem, he's speaking of Jesus here, the one who was Jewish, the one of the first or second resurrection, the true false Messiah who heals the blind and presents himself as saying, I am the truth and the life. At the moment of his death, the temple veil is supposed to have torn. Okay, now note, again, Derrida was not a Christian. He's responding as a Jewish writer to this Christian claim. And this reference to, Jesus, there's a story in the Gospels where Jesus opens up the biblical text and says, I'm essentially the meaning of the text. I'm the truth and the life. This is heretical from, let's say, the perspective of the Pharisees, or from an exegetical Jewish perspective, Judaic perspective, that the reading of the text is always an open-ended process. No single human being can know or represent the meaning of the text. That the text itself is something that is incumbent on one to wrestle with. This is why you have, let's say, for instance, in Talmud commentaries, you have commentaries of different rabbis through the ages who wrestle with or work with the text and interpret its meaning. And so a Judaic perspective is always going to be a little bit skeptical about this kind of claim. Truth that is self-evident. And this is, again, what Derrida is criticizing, that the veil remains. There's truth as self-evident, never discloses itself to us as such. This is what he's suggesting. This veil will be for you, says Yahweh to Moses, the separation between the holy and the most holy, between the tabernacle and the tabernacle of tabernacles. The veil tearing down the middle is that of the end of such a separation, of that isolation, that unbelievable solitude of belief. I know of no other separation in the world, or that would be commensurable with that one, analogous, comparable to that one, which allows us to think nonetheless every other separation, and first of all, the separation that separates from the holy other. And so, like, say, for instance, Fatema Mernissi in The Veil and the Elite, what Derrida is suggesting here, I think, is that in Judaism, the concept of the veil is quite complex and something that one is never really done with altogether. One never comes to the end of its complexity, not in the way that in some passages in Savoir, Cixous seems to suggest. I mean, she's being poetic and maybe hyperbolic, but it's this hyperbole that Derrida, I think, is urging her and his readers to be a little cautious of. Whether or not this unbelievable separation, belief itself, faith, came to an end with the death of Christ, will it ever be comprehensible in the veiled folds of a Greek aletheia, or unconcealment? Veil, curtain, drape is nothing less than the dwelling of God, his dwelling, his ethos, his being there, his sojourn. An absolute knowledge, savoir, which again is the title of Cixous' piece, will never accept this unique separation, that in the unveiled place of the holy other, nothing should present itself, that there be nothing there that is, nothing that is present, nothing that is in the present. Truth, if we need it, and if you still care, still seems to wait. Okay, so the latter quote really is referring to this what Derrida and other places will call Messianicity. And so he distinguishes between, in, let's say, Spectres of Marx and elsewhere, between Messianism and Messianicity. Messianism being particular messianic claims in particular dogmatic traditions of the Abrahamic traditions, Whereas Messianicity, this term that he coins, is about expecting the truth to come, waiting for the truth to come, which is very different from saying that the truth has come. And so whatever the truth is, whatever the truth that we realize during the moment of unveiling is, when it occurs, if this event in time were to occur, it's something that we wait to happen, that we're waiting to happen. All right, now in Christianity, and Derrida makes this same point, that in Christianity, Jesus may have, one claims that he was the Messiah and the truth was revealed, for instance, in the moment that the veil was torn open and the truth as such revealed itself to us as such. But even if this is so, Derrida makes the point that in Christianity, one still waits for the truth to come again, for the second coming. Now, in Judaism, there's a belief in Messianism that the Messiah will come, but that's different from saying that the Messiah has come. In Judaism, Jesus is not the Messiah, so one is still waiting for the Messiah to come. So what Derrida is calling Messianicity is really more of a structure of expectation. One waits for the truth as such to appear, but that doesn't mean that it has appeared, or perhaps never, perhaps it won't appear. We can't know. What's important is that we wait for it, for Derrida. It's deferred, in effect. Now, again, I want to, in passing, also draw your attention to his reference to aletheia. This is a very important concept in the thought of Martin Heidegger, which he literally translates as unconcealment. Aletheia was the Greek goddess truth, not the goddess of truth, but the goddess truth, who, when Parmenides, in his famous poem, and Heidegger has a book on this called Parmenides, when the thinker Parmenides travels to this clearing, goes through the woods, comes to a clearing, aletheia, the goddess truth, discloses herself to him as such, or what was concealed becomes unconcealed. And so the very Greek notion of truth, which is, say, prior to the Platonic notion of truth as unconcealment, also is tied up with the question of the veil as well. And so for, say, someone like Parmenides, truth was not, what is correct or correct perception, to put it in Cartesian terms, in which then the false or the untrue would then be the false or incorrect in perception, incorrect perception. The truth would be a matter of unconcealment, and its negation would then be forgetting. And the word aletheia is linked to the river Aletheia, the river of forgetting as well. And so the event happens, truth is unconcealed, and then the event of its unconcealment is forgotten. This is a Heideggerian theme, the theme of the forgetting of being in effect. So this is what Derrida's commenting on as well. And so his essay, like Cixous, there's a lot of philosophical concepts that are there's a lot going on in these brief texts. Let me just put it that way. Now, in an earlier text, this is cited in a footnote from Vales, which was not in Derrida's original, but the editor placed it in there, and I'm glad he did, because it's very illuminating. Derrida wrote a book called Gloss, which is a response to the thought of Hegel, whom Derrida sees as being a particularly Christian philosopher. And Hegel said a lot of derogatory things about Judaism. He said a lot of derogatory things about Islam. He called, for instance, he said Africa has no history. Hegel's not very popular in Africa for a lot of reasons. But Derrida, as a Jewish man, is responding, a Jewish philosopher is responding to Hegel, a Christian philosopher. And this is, let's read what he says. He says, "This place and this figure have a singular structure, the structure that encloses its void within itself, shelters only its own interiorized desert." And the theme of the desert is really important for Derrida on other places too. It's linked to the theme of nothingness, the chora. "It opens onto nothing, encloses nothing, contains as its treasure only nothingness, a hole, an empty spacing, a death or a dead man, because according to Hegel, space is death, and because this space is also one of absolute vacuity, nothing behind the curtains, hence the ingenuous surprise of the non-Jew when he opens, when he is allowed to open, and when he violates the tabernacle, when he enters the dwelling or the temple, and after so many ritual detours to reach the secret center, he discovers nothing, only nothingness, no center, no heart, an empty space, nothing. You undo the bands, move the cloths, pull back the veils, part the curtains, nothing but a black hole or a deep gaze, colorless, formless, lifeless. Now, for those who've read Derrida, you'll know that the thought that Cora, what Plato calls Cora in the Timaeus, which is one of the basic concepts of metaphysics, nothingness along with being and becoming, is a major concept in Derrida's thought. And I think it's John Caputo who says that Cora is a Sir word for différance, another important term in Derridian thought, the idea of this difference and difference brought together, spacing and silence, spacing in written discourse, silence in spoken discourse. In other words, Derrida is going to say the condition of a word's intelligibility as a written word depends upon the blank spaces between the letters that appear. And so too, in spoken discourse, the condition of a spoken word's intelligibility is that it be punctuated with silence. And so this idea of it becomes, let's say, in Aristotle, the tabula rasa, the blank space, in the blank slate in John Locke, this idea of emptiness, nothingness. This is what he's meditating upon, and this is going to be very important not only for Derrida's thinking, but for Judaic theology as well. Indeed, the thinking of nothingness, which is in Plato, was in Egypt long before it was in Plato. The Egyptians had a developed concept of nothingness, and this notion also passes into Judaism as well. Now, you can see here on the far left an image of the temple. We can see the Holy of Holies, and you can see that that behind the curtain of the Holy of Holies, and you can see this also. Let me go forward. This is an Egyptian version of this, and many the temples of the Nile were in some ways similar to the Judaic temples as well. The difference was that in the temples of the Nile, you would have a Holy of Holies, and within that Holy of Holies, you would have a fetish or a god that would be taken out and paraded during ritual festivities, but for the rest of the year would be shrouded behind a veil. Indeed, the most early ancient Egyptian symbol for the divine is a stick wrapped in a cloth, or a veil or a stick that is veiled in effect. The stick would in some sense be the fetish, the cloth would be the veil covering it. And so in the Egyptian temples, you would have a Holy of Holies too, as you would in the Judaic temple, but behind the veil, there would be a fetish. What from the Mosaic perspective would be an idol that he would iconoclastically want to destroy, like when he comes down from Sinai and smashes the Ten Commandments against the golden calf and has the golden calf melted and makes those who worshipped it drink the gold. But here you can see in the case of the temple in Judaism, when you pull what he's referring to in Hegel's thought, Derrida and Hegel's thought, is this idea that if you pull back the curtain, you're not going to find anything there. It's going to be completely empty. And this is a matter of consternation. He says to the non-Jew who wants to violate the temple, pulls back the veil and is thinking that he'll find some kind of fetish that he can then steal or do whatever with, but is astonished to see that it's completely empty. And this emptiness, this nothingness, is linked to this idea of the Cora in Derrida's thought, which is a really important concept for him. Now, on the far right, you see, this is from Franz Kafka's The Trial, an image, an illustration of this, the story, this little Kafkan story of Before the Law, where a man comes to this door and there's a guard standing before it, and he tells the man that behind him is another door with another guard and another door and another door, and it just goes all the way, doors all the way down. And so you can think of it as this being a kind of a wormhole that opens up onto the abyss. And this is what Derrida is referring to, absolute nothingness. It's like the mise en abîme, putting two mirrors together, and just the bottom drops out in effect. Now he's writing this as he goes to Brazil, and he's speaking of Sao Paulo. There you see in Rio de Janeiro an image, a famous image of Christ, and on the left in Sao Paulo you see a image of Saint. This is a figure of Saint Paul, a city named after Saint Paul. And so Saint Paul is a really interesting figure for Derrida because he was originally his name as a Jew, his name was Saul. He becomes Paul. He's a Jew Greek in effect, and Derrida, as a man who has one foot in both cultures, I think is fascinated by Paul in some ways, but he's also very critical of Paul. And Paul, in the Christian tradition, wrote quite a lot on the question of the veil. And so Derrida, again, is a man who is not a Christian, is going to respond to the thought of Paul, who was a Jew, who became a Christian and had very particular ideas about the veil in Christianity. And here's what Derrida says in his passage as he's thinking about his flight going to the city named after St. Paul. Have I managed to demonstrate it? What separates the logic or topic of the veil from those of the shawl called the talith? This is the Jewish prayer shawl, the talith. This talith, unique up to and including the number of its corners, wings, fringes. The uniqueness of this reference from being or becoming like every veil, merely a figure, a symbol, a trope. How to avoid hearing even here, in the name of this city, dedicated to St. Paul, the Epistle to the Romans, which is Paul's most famous epistle. Its author thought he knew the literality of the letter. He prided himself on being able to distinguish, for the first time, he no doubt thought wrongly, the circumcision of the heart, according to the breath and the spirit, from the circumcision of body or flesh, circumcision according to the letter, quote unquote. In the Epistle to the Corinthians, the same Paul who attacked the literal circumcision of men, that same one wanted to veil women and unveil men. All right, so, okay, there's a lot going on here. Now, I can't assume that my listeners here, those reading this text, are familiar with the Epistle to the Romans, but this is a really important Pauline epistle that establishes much Christian theology, is going to be very influential for figures like Augustine and Luther and Calvin and so on much later. We can't look at the whole thing, but we will focus very specifically on what Paul has to say about the veil. And it's linked here to the question of circumcision, which, remember, in the Christian tradition, Paul is going to say that actual circumcision is not as important, or literal circumcision is not as important as circumcision of the heart. And so Paul's going to distinguish metaphorical or figurative circumcision from literal circumcision of the body. And so in Judaism and in Judaism and Islam, circumcision must be literally performed. But in Christianity, Paul's going to say, well, look, circumcision does some good things. It's fine for Jews, but it's not essential. What's essential is that one has circumcision of the heart. And so we get this figurative idea of circumcision. Now, the context of this, of course, is that Europe at this time, the Greco-Roman world, was profoundly opposed to the idea of circumcision. If you go look at the ancient Greek statues of disrobed men, you'll see that none of them are circumcised. And so if Christianity was really to spread in the Greco-Roman world in the way that it did, this problem of circumcision would have to be addressed, because there might be many people who would be willing to convert, but would not be so thrilled about the idea of circumcision. And so Paul's going to say, look, you don't have to be actually circumcised. What's important is that you have circumcision of the heart. This means, in effect, if circumcision is the sign of the covenant, it's about your relationship to the other. Literal circumcision, let's say if you're circumcised by your father or by the rabbi through your father or on behalf of your father, it's about entering into a contract or a covenant with your father, and you're circumcised as a sign of that covenant or that contract that you make, with your parent, who then provides you with all of the names and privileges that are associated with that covenant in the moment of literally inscribing in the inscription of the name on your body, which is what circumcision is. It means the Hebraic word is milha, which means to cut, but it also means to name. So you're essentially cut a name. Now, in Paul's going to say, look, as long as you have this relationship with God, that's what's important. Is when he's emphasizing circumcision of the heart, he's emphasizing that one must be in a covenant, in a relationship with God. That's his point. But he doesn't insist on literal circumcision. He only insists on figurative circumcision. So we'll come back to that. But I want to first look at the question on Paul and the veil. And this is what Derrida is going to be relatively silent on this, but I'm going to come back to that. But he is going to say things very specifically, going to criticize Paul on the question of the veil. And he's very hostile, I think, even to Paul, much in the same way that, say, Nietzsche was hostile to Paul. And that's interesting to think about. Now, the talith is the prayer shawl in Judaism worn by men, and Derrida speaks of wearing his own talith. In effect, that in other words, he too, men in Judaism, like women, have veils, and so we can think of the veil as being, like I say, in the Islamic tradition, the hijab is associated with women, but men also wear prayer caps, coverings on their head when they go into the mosque. And so in Judaism too, both men and women alike wear head coverings. And so if all of them are Abrahamic traditions, the question is, why does the veil not pass into the Christian tradition? And in effect, it does pass into the Christian tradition, but Paul's going to have a decisive influence on the particular kind of way that the veil will pass into the Christian tradition. And here's what Derrida is going to say about this. He says, it is as though the fate of humanity were again going to depend on whoever holds power over women about the veil. He finds this to be true in Paul's writing. And I am not just talking about an abusive interpretation of the Quran. And this is like, for instance, in my lecture on the same website on Fatema Mernissi's The Veil and the Male Elite. That's precisely what she's addressing, an abusive interpretation of the Quran, enabling this, what Mernissi calls this male elite, to have power over women. And I says, that's not what I'm talking about. He says, that's not just what I'm talking about. So St. Paul in the Christian tradition, he has something to do with it. And we're going to have to talk about him a little bit more. And then he says, what I admire most in Nietzsche is his lucidity about Paul. Now, this comes early in the text, and it's later that he will return to the question of Paul. But this comes at a point where he just drops this comment in. But he does say what he likes about Nietzsche is his lucidity about Paul. Now, there on the left, you see a picture of the philosopher Nietzsche. There on the right, you see an image, an icon of Paul. Now, Nietzsche was brutal when it came to Paul. He had the most caustic, vicious things, really, to say about Paul. Nietzsche was also the author of a book called The Antichrist. And Heidegger, who was influenced by Nietzsche, described this book as a terrible book. He didn't mean that in the sense that it was a bad book, but just terrible as in the audacity of Nietzsche, and some of the things that he says are just, about Christianity, just take your breath away. And he was very hostile to Paul, but Derrida is affirming this hostility to Paul, and that's something worth thinking about. And here's one of the reasons why. Derrida says, I'm against those who prescribe the veil and other such things, against those who forbid it too, and who think they can forbid it, imagining that this is good, that it is possible, and that it is meaningful, not in a hurry. The scholarly, the secular, and the democratic belong through and through to cultures of the talith and the veil, etc. People don't even realize any longer. Contamination is everywhere. And we hadn't finished. I haven't finished with St. Paul. The one who wanted to veil the heads of the women and unveil those of the men, that very one who denounced Moses and the children of Israel. He accused them of having given in to the veil, of not having known how to lift the veil over the face of God, the veil over the covenant, the veil on the heart. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, but I might note too that Derrida is, he even says at one point, he says the word secular is always already a religious concept. In effect, it implies the religious. And so a lot of times, basically we may think that we're more liberal than we are, completely oblivious to the influences of the Abrahamic traditions, particularly, let's say, in the West. And so what we think of as the secular, what we think of as the democratic is, in effect, deeply impacted by Judaism, by Christianity, particularly in ways that we're not even really aware of, that this contamination affects us in ways that he's trying to bring to our attention. I think this is a really valid point. Again, most of my students at Western Washington University don't have much experience with religion, or maybe at most they've gone to a few Christian services and so on. And so those who come into my classes sometimes say, well, why do we need to even talk about these scriptural texts? And I think Derrida is alerting us to this. This is one of the reasons why, because these ideas are latent in our culture, and so we can be influenced by theologies, philosophies, ideologies, and so on that we're completely oblivious to. And so we need to be aware of them. And that's part of what deconstruction in the Derridian sense is about unpeeling these sedimented layers of meaning and concepts that we're not aware of, bringing them to the threshold of consciousness for us. Now, this Corinthians 11, 3 through 10, I'm going to quote here the New International Version, have the passages of Paul that are cited in Derrida's Veils. Now, Derrida does cite them not in the text itself, but in the footnotes. I would caution you, though, however, that a lot of times Derrida is very interested in marginalia, and a lot of times what appears in the footnotes may be even more significant than what appears in the actual text. And so you got to be really, when you're reading Derrida, you got to be really attentive to what takes place in the footnotes. But here he's quoting Paul, who says, I want you to realize, this is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, a letter that Paul wrote to a community of Christians in Corinthians, the town, that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved. If it is, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. All right, now there's a lot going on in these passages by Paul, but these are the texts that Derrida is zeroing in on. I might note, too, that it's from Paul that we get this idea that it's natural that women have long hair, and it's natural that men have short hair. And so this kind of conservatism about short hair for men and long hair for women really, comes from the theology of Paul. But he's saying here that, man, but basically what Paul does, we could say, well, in all of the Abrahamic traditions, let's say prior to Paul, whenever anybody went into a place of worship, one's head had to be covered. Now, this is true in Judaism as well. When one goes into the synagogue, if you're a man, you got to at least put on a yarmulke. If you're a woman, you got to have your head veiled as well. In Islam, men and women alike wear veils when they come into the mosque, or a man wears a prayer cap. And in Christianity at this time, what Paul really did is it wasn't that Paul was assigning the veil to women. It was that he was taking the veil from men. And his logic, again, is very similar to the logic we discussed earlier with respect to the second commandment of the Mosaic Law, which is that in Christian theology, Jesus is God, and God has showed himself to us as such. And so therefore we know what God looks like. And this is why the second commandment is said to be part of the old law, and why representations of images of God, of Jesus, can be placed in churches and cathedrals and so on, because Jesus was God. We know what God looks like, since he represented himself to us, we can now create representations of him as well. All right, but the logic, so Paul is merely extending this logic, and he's saying, well, we know what God looks like. God looks like a man, and so a man is in this image. Let's say man is a more accurate representation or representation of this image. Woman, too, is in the image of Christ, but with a difference, in effect, and that difference is a gender difference. You can say, look, women, this is a obvious inversion of the natural order, but this is what appears in the book of Genesis, that woman is born from the side of man. And so Paul's, in a natural biological sense, man comes from woman, but Paul's saying woman came from man, and so woman is created in man's image and was created for man, not woman. Man was not created for woman. And so you get this kind of hierarchy that develops, and this is what Derrida is being, a little bit, critical of. Now, so like here you see images of Catholic veils. Now, pre-Vatican II, after Vatican II, which was a important moment in the history of the Catholic Church in the 1950s. At that time, women no longer had to wear veils in church, but prior to that time, women had to wear veils when they went in to celebrate Mass. So Catholics today may not be that used to veils, but previously it was very common for women to wear veils, but women would wear a veil during Mass. Men did not wear veils. There you see on the far left a Catholic woman wearing a head covering or a veil. On the far right, you see a little girl at her first communion also wearing a veil, which is still commonly done today. And in the middle, you see Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan meeting with Pope John Paul II, and as a matter of respect, she's wearing a veil. This is even after Vatican II in her meeting with the Pope. And as you can see from the Pope, the look on the Pope's face, he seems to be quite happy, at least with meeting her, maybe about the veil too. So this is the Christian idea of the veil. So in Christianity, up until Vatican II, women did wear veils. After Vatican II, they did not, but men did not. Ronald Reagan, you can see, is not wearing a veil there in that image. It says, and here's what Derrida says, and this very mild, this terrible Paul dares, for he dares with all the daring whose monstrous progeny are our history and culture. See the erections of São Paulo the Proud. These are the statues of St. Paul in Brazil. This Paul who preferred a good Greek to a bad Jew. This Paul who claimed to know literally what is the breath of spirit and teach it to the Jew so that he would become a good Jew better than the good Greek. This Paul leaves us to judge. He dares to say to us, Jews or Greeks, that he leaves us to judge. And then he quotes Paul, who says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. Now, Derrida does a kind of a Freudian reading of this. And he speaks of, pubic hair on the pudendum as being also a kind of a veil, a covering, much like the hymen as well, in the vagina. And so this is what Derrida says that Paul suggests that Paul is saying, is that this idea of hair is akin to a natural veil in effect. But within this logic of Paul, to put it in Derridian terms, one could refer to what Derrida in, let's say, his book Disseminations refers to as the logic of the dangerous supplement. And this logic goes something like this. B can stand in for A, but it can also take the place of A. All right, now, to put this in more concrete terms, if we look on the left, we can see, logos is the transcendental ideal word in Plato, the word that Plato tells us is written on the soul. Speaking, Plato tells us, is a copy of the logos, but Plato says writing is a copy of speaking. So in effect, it's a copy of a copy, and this is one of the reasons why it is less inherently truthful than speaking. And so if we think of this logic of the dangerous supplement, we could call speaking is A, and writing is B. And so we could say, well, writing can stand in for speaking, but it can also take the place of speaking. And so, Plato will say this in the Phaedrus. This is something that Derrida discusses in Dissemination, or in his often anthologized essay, Plato's Pharmacy, that that one has to be careful about writing because one doesn't want to mistake it for the living spoken word. It can be useful as a mnemonic device to jar our memory, but let's not confuse the dead letter with the living word. And so it's this opposition of speaking and writing that Derrida is going to call into question. But he's also going to say, look, it's not just a matter of calling this particular issue into question, the idea that speaking in this phono-logocentric way is inherently more truthful than writing. But he's going to see this logic of the dangerous supplement at work in many other places as well. Let me give you one other instance of this. In the Republic, Plato will say, he'll speak of the ideal bed, the actual bed that you sleep on, which is a copy of the ideal bed, and then a painter might come along and paint a painting of the bed that you sleep on. Well, for Plato, the painting is a copy of the actual bed. The bed itself is a copy of the ideal bed that is this transcendental ideal bed. And the painter compared to the carpenter then is a relatively, useless fellow. You can't get a good night's sleep on top of a painting. You need an actual bed. So again, let's think of the painted bed can stand in for the actual bed, but it can also, take the place of the actual bed, which would be an absurdity. And so, there's a stigmatizing of this supplement that takes place in Western logic. Derrida will speak of this as the logic of the pharmacon. Plato will call the writing, he'll call it a pharmacon, or like a pharmaceutical, as opposed to a pharmaceutical property, as opposed to the spoken word. Okay, that's a complicated topic. I don't want to get too far into that here, except to note that this is essentially the same logic Derrida finds at work in Plato's views upon the veil, that woman becomes, if man is made in the image of Christ, who in the Christian tradition is also the Logos, woman is said to be made in the image of man. And so woman is a copy of man, or a copy of a copy, where man is a copy of the actual ideal. And so woman then becomes, according to this logic, a dangerous supplement to man. I could think woman can stand in for man, but can also take the place of man. And this is, we could think of, well, in the politics of friendship, Derrida will speak of in the realm of the political, woman can be the honorary brother who's allowed into the realm of the politic, but is sort of kept in her place also. And so this is a prominent Derridian theme. I just mentioned it to you in passing, but this criticism of Paul that he articulates can be understood in light of what he calls elsewhere the logic of the dangerous supplement. Now, he will say, too, in Veils, that one will always be able to take the talith for a fetish. And this is something that he's being very cautious about, that the talith should not itself become a fetish. And in his little essay called Choreographies, which is an interview that he did on the question of feminism, Derrida stated, one could say quite accurately that the hymen does not exist. Now, the hymen is a figure of the veil. And this is the same point Mernissi makes in the Veil and the Malit, that in Arabic and in Islam, the word hijab itself has a usage in anatomy. The hijab is the hymen of the hijab. The hymen is the hijab of virginity, and Derrida, is saying something very similar, that the hymen has this status as a kind of a veil, but he wants to be careful when he says that want to make sure that the talith doesn't become a fetish. He's also saying one wants to make sure that the hymen, or the veil, does not become a fetish either, because in this way it would become merely another fetish, in the same way, say, that in phallo-logocentric discourse, that the phallus becomes said to be, a ding on zich, or in effect a kind of a thing in itself that has an existence as pure presence, which is what he's calling into question. So Derrida says, anything constituting the value of existence is foreign to the hymen. And if there were hymen, I'm not saying if the hymen existed, property value would be no more appropriate to it. How can one then attribute the existence of the hymen properly to woman? And so what he's really responding to here is he's very cautious about, he makes this distinction between what he's calling a reactive feminism and a non-reactive feminism. And so he doesn't want feminism to become yet another fallow logocentric discourse. And in this, he's totally on the same page with Helene Cixous, if one reads her Laugh of the Medusa, that the danger of a phallic mother or a phallic feminism merely reinscribes many of the same problems that we get in misogynistic discourse. And so the question, the problem is overcoming the fetishism of any gender essentialism, whether it's male or female. Here's what Derrida says: this theory, this thought of the event without truth, unveiled or revealed, without phallologocentrism of the Greco, Judeo, Paulino, Islamo, Freudian, Heideggerian, Lacanian veil, without phallophoria, that is, without procession or theory of the phallus, without veiling, unveiling of the phallus, or even of the mere place strictly hemmed in of the phallus, living or dead. Unless you do something different, which is what he's seeking to do, you can only oppose the concept of the phallus to another concept or another theory. The phallus, let's say the hypostatus of the phallus to the hypostatus of the hymen, turning the veil into a fetish. This is what he's cautioning about. A knowledge just like any other. And Derrida's point is, look, it's not enough to have concepts at one's disposal. You have to know how to set them, like one sets sails, often to save oneself, of course, but on condition of knowing how to catch the wind in one's sails. And the sail is, again, yet another figure of the veil or the hymen. A question of force. Concepts and veils are there only in view of this question of force. Which, when force here is not, I don't think we should think of this in Nietzschean terms as a matter of power, the way, say, someone like Michel Foucault would articulate it, but rather linked to the idea of spirit, spiritus, ruha in Judaism. Now, I want to, after looking at Derrida's deconstruction of the veil, his thinking of the veil, or his sort of preliminary deconstruction, that is, it's not a full-fledged one. These are comments on Cixous' essay that are very brief. I want to return just briefly to his thinking about Paul. Now, with respect to circumcision, you can see there Paul is on the road to Damascus. This is a very famous story where Paul is blinded. Paul himself is the 12th apostle who takes the place of Judas after Judas betrays Christ and then hangs himself. But it's interesting that even though Paul is considered to be an apostle, he never actually saw Christ in life except in this vision that he has on the road to Damascus, where this bright light appears so bright that it actually blinds him. So again, we're back to this question of blindness. Now, in the case of Derrida, he's in an ambivalent position as a Jewish philosopher in a predominantly Eurocentric setting, and much of his thought can be said to be in dialogue with Greek culture. I want to show you a brief clip from a film, just a very small clip, about a minute and a half or so, which alludes to a problem that I'd like to say something about before we conclude our lecture. This is from a Kirby Dick film that's really worth seeing if you haven't seen it. I recommend it. You can find it on the internet pretty easily.
His mother's grave is profaned. His parents never read any of his books. He cries out, "Mommy, I'm scared," every night until she lets him sleep on a sofa near them. One side of his face is paralyzed for 3 weeks, leaving his eye open continuously, unblinking. His father composes his own death notice shortly before he dies of cancer. He is expelled from school because he is Jewish. He learns he was given a secret name, Eli, after the Jewish prophet Elijah that isn't on his birth certificate. He fails his first entrance exam to the university. He writes his first novel at age 15 about the theft of a diary and blackmail for its return. He pretends to learn Hebrew so as to read it without understanding it. He is arrested and thrown in prison for 24 hours in Prague for transporting drugs which the authorities plant on him. He receives a collect call from someone who identifies himself as Martini Heidegger. He declines an offer from Marguerite Duras to play a part in one of her films. As an adolescent, he dreams of becoming a professional soccer player. He doesn't circumcise his sons, greatly upsetting his mother and father. He suffers from sleeplessness and nervous collapse from the overuse of sleeping tablets and amphetamines. His older brother lives only 7 days, dying just a year before he is born.
Okay, so a couple of things there. There's a lot there. I just want to comment on a couple of things very briefly. One is that the illusion in this film, these anecdotes about his private life, and Derrida was very reticent about his private life, and so I don't want to, in honoring that, I don't want to go too far into this material, except to say that this eye condition that he had is quite interesting because it left him his one eye open, and this led to a condition of dryness in his eye. Can you imagine how painful that must be? And a realization about the importance of our eyelids closing over our eyes to wet them with tears. And this reiterates this idea of the importance of blindness. Like, and Derrida will speak in other places of being like, as an academic, we have to be really careful about casting our eyes upon objects. The other, for instance, the other human being imagined as an object that we turn into a kind of an insect. We look at with the insect eyes of an unblinking insect, and unblinking, dry-eyed clarity is perhaps not as significant as looking at the other with an eye of compassion that has been, wetted by lowering the eyelid, which becomes a kind of a veil. He'll speak of this also in Spectres of Marx as the visor effect, the opening and closing of the eye, linked to the importance of, the recognition of the importance of not seeing in a cultural context where vision is so emphasized from the Greeks onward, particularly in, say, Descartes. But the second thing I wanted to draw your attention to here in that brief clip was the allusion to, this is something John Caputo talks a lot about, and I'm somewhat reluctant to bring it up here, but I think since Derrida has criticized Paul in such strong terms, it's only fair to do so, and that is the allusion to Derrida's decision not to circumcise his own sons. This would seem to be, if Derrida is critical of Paul on the veil and on what Paul has to say about the veil, I think I would just note in passing that he does seem to follow Paul in this regard with respect to his approach to the question of circumcision, which was something that didn't make his parents very happy about anyway. Because again, in Judaism as in Islam, circumcision is literal circumcision is not sublated by the Pauline idea of circumcision of the heart. So he seems to go the way of Paul, at least on that question. All right, in closing here, I wanted to just also briefly draw your attention to the reference to this title, the silkworm. And he says, this is something that comes at the conclusion of Veils. He says, this is everything that had begun the night before. I had just read Savoir, Cixous text. And before closing my eyes to give in to sleep, I let myself be invaded, as they say, gently, in gentleness by a childhood memory, a true childhood memory, the opposite of a dream. And here I embroider no longer. And he tells us this little anecdote about how when he was a child, he cultivated silkworms. Now remember, silkworms make silk, and silk cloth can be made from silk. Obviously, a talith of silk can be made. It says, before I was 13, before ever having worn a talith and having even dreamed of possessing my own, I cultivated silkworms. It was impossible to discern a sex in silkworms. There was indeed something like a brown mouth, but you could not recognize in it the orifice you had to imagine to be at the origin of their silk. This milk become thread, this filament prolonging their body and remaining attached to it for a certain length of time. The extruded saliva of a very fine sperm, shiny, gleaming, the miracle of a female or a feminine ejaculation, which would catch the light and which I drank in with my eyes. It secreted the secretion. It secreted. The silkworm produced outside itself, before itself, what would never leave it, a thing that was no other than itself, a thing that was not a thing. Now, if you, again, this is quite poetic, but if you unpack what's going on here, this gives a pretty encapsulated sense of the kind of écriture or writing that he's affirming. Also, I think, Helene Cixous does as well in her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, this idea of feminine writing. But note, he says here that it's the silkworm, you can't really discern a sex. So it's an image that affirms an idea of overcoming gender binaries as well, and thinking of a writing that's neither a phallologocentric or a hymen-centric reactive feminine writing, but rather something that is other than either. And so this is obviously a poetic figure, but I would encourage you to read it carefully, and you can get a sense of what he's referring to, or the kind of writing that he's dreaming of, which would not be tied to these phallologocentric ideas like he sees present in Paul's writing about the question of the veil. There's an image of a silkworm. So we'll conclude on that note. And again, I hope you enjoy reading this text. It's a lot of fun. It raises a lot of provocative questions, but it also has a lot to teach us about different perspectives on the veil.